Indiana State Music Teachers Association. My name is Janna Williamson. Welcome to my home piano studio in the suburbs of Chicago. I'm very honored to be speaking to you, especially in the great state of Indiana where there are so many fine musicians and teachers. Today's talk is titled 2020 Vision for Piano Teachers, Building a Foundation for Expressive Performance. And I hope that you already downloaded the handout that goes along with this, because I will be following, especially in the beginning part, I'll be following the handout pretty closely. So I would strongly encourage you to have that. So let's talk about vision first. Any good company, organization, business, church, or entrepreneur is going to have thoughts about why they do what they do and what they want to accomplish. Perhaps you have a friend who leads some organization and this person just oozes vision all the time and regularly gets people to rally behind his or her cause. I'm sure that we all know people like this who raise a lot of money and lead things and are always getting people on fire. I know a lot of people like that. I've done some reading about leadership, and I realized that leadership, even within the piano studio, is very important. So the questions that leaders deal with all the time are, where are we going? That's our vision. And how are we going to get there? That's our strategy. So those are the two questions at the top of your handout. So like I said, I'm going to be referring to that. Where are we going? That's our vision. And how are we going to get there? That's our strategy. So these questions can and should be asked by any good leader, and piano teachers who want to be financially successful and make a positive impact on their students cannot afford to be any different in this regard. So let's discuss vision. What are some specific things that you consider your goals for your piano students? Where do you want your students to go? So I teach exclusively pre-college students from very young all the way up to graduating from high school in my studio here. And some of my goals or visions for my students are things like, I want my students to have a lifelong love of music so that when they leave my studio, they still love music and they want to come back to it, whether they do anything professionally at all or if they're just enjoying music for their own personal enjoyment. I want my students to have technical ease and facility at the piano. That's something that takes a long time to build. I want my students to be able to sight read. And similarly, I want my students to be able to read a chord chart or a lead sheet. So these are all different things that if I'm thinking about having students long term, when they leave, I want them to be able to do this. These are all worthy goals, and you really could write a presentation on any of them and then strategically how you're going to get to that point. So let's take one really small and objective goal just so that we can kind of flesh this out a little bit before we dive into today's actual topic. And that would be scales and speed of playing your scales. In Illinois, we have our own AIM program, Achievement in Music. I know you have one in Indiana too, and I'm sorry to say I'm not familiar with yours at all, but I am highly familiar with the one that we have in Illinois. When I started teaching the AIM curriculum, I was only teaching lower and mid levels, and so it was a few years before I had students who went all the way up to our top level, which is level 12. And when I got there, I noticed that the technical requirement for my students' scales is to be able to play 4 octaves and 16th notes at 120. Now that is pretty fast, but it is really a reasonable goal for students who have started playing scales when they were very young and just incrementally worked up their speed as they've progressed through their years of piano study. So with that goal in mind of that 120, knowing now that I have several students who do reach that level 12, I want to make sure that when they are much younger, doing level 5 or 6 or 7, wherever they are in their scale study, that I'm working them through a very progressive, incremental way of being able to play their scales fluidly, with ease, and gradually increasing our tempo goals so that they won't be shocked when they get to that top level. A teacher who doesn't teach upper levels or advanced students might not have that 120 goal in mind because they just might not ever think about that level. And so that teacher might not insist on strategies or standards that I might insist on at those lower levels. And that's fine for the present, and it's fine if your student is a recreational student and is never going to get to that kind of advanced level playing. But it is short-sighted if your student is ever going to get there, because once they reach that level, they're going to suddenly need a cramming session to be able to play their scales at that speed. So what could have been a smooth, slow progression with that vision in mind for the end becomes something that's very uncomfortable and overly crammed and fast-paced. So let's leave scales aside now. And for the rest of this presentation, I'd like to use this type of framework of thinking about our vision for something that's much more fun and a much bigger idea than just being able to play your scales at 120. The vision that I'd like to use today is we want to lead our students to achieve expressive performance of their historical repertoire. So this is on your handout, so I'll say it one more time. We want to lead our students to achieve expressive performance of their historical repertoire. Most of our pre-college and recreational students will not go on to be college piano majors or play the advanced repertoire that would be needed to attain a performance degree. However, if we do not have advanced repertoire as our guide and our goal, then we are selling our students short. No first grade teacher in America teaches young children to read in hopes that ultimately one day they will read the Boxcar Children. They hold hope that these children will someday in the future read the great classics of the English language literature. So, humor me for a bit here. Let's pretend that every student who walks into your studio as a beginner is headed for proficient, expressive performances of Beethoven sonatas, preludes and fugues from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Chopin ballades, Prokofiev concerti, and many other things of that level. Put this at the front of your brain as your vision, your end goal, your finish line. If that were the case, would your strategy in the elementary and early intermediate years be any different than it is now? My philosophy is that excellence can and should be expected of all students at the early levels. This means that I want my less advanced students to play their minuets and their sonatinas and easier character pieces beautifully, expressively, with a lot of life and sparkle and energy. Of course, since all students have their different strengths and affinities, not all will reach the same level of accomplishment on all pieces. And our expectations as teachers should be tailored to the individual sitting in each lesson. But the vision for the ultimate sound goal should be the same. So just to reiterate that, because that's on your handout, since all of our students have different strengths and affinities, not all students will reach the same level of accomplishment on all pieces, but the vision for the ultimate sound goal should be the same. So let me cast a vision for this vision. Regardless of the particular late elementary or intermediate student sitting on the bench in front of me, I want to have the vision of that accomplished, mature student that he or she could become in the future. Expressive performance is a particular concern to me for 4 reasons. Number 1, this is what music is all about. I mean, it should be pretty plain and simple, but I think we forget this sometimes, that art in any form is the expression of the human condition. And so we should always have the goal of teaching our students to play music expressively. Number 2, dots and lines and letters on the page are not music. That book that you pick up, that's not music. Music is the in-time embodiment of sound. I think our students forget that sometimes too. Number 3, music is for sharing. When we sit down and perform a Beethoven sonata, we are simply a vessel for that sonata. We are giving the gift of that masterwork, that beautiful piece of music, to our audience. We are sharing with them something that we have poured our hearts into, and again, we are giving them that gift. And then lastly, and I think this is the most important one when talking about pre-college students, personal emotional connection is motivational for students. Our students must own the piece. As soon as a student creates that emotional connection with the repertoire that they are playing, they begin to forge that identity as a musician. They begin to create that identity as a pianist. And that is one of our greatest responsibilities as teachers, is to foster that identity within our students, particularly in the preteen and teenage years. If they don't identify as musicians and as pianists, then they're not going to stay in lessons very long. So let's talk briefly about why a student might not accomplish our vision, our goal for a piece of historical repertoire. So I'm sure you could come up with a lot of reasons, but I came up with 4 that I'd like to share with you here for this. So number 1, she has special needs or physical limitations. And again, we are always working with the student in front of us. And so if a student does have special needs, yes, of course, she is not going to be held to the same standard that other students might be. Number 2, the student does not have an adequate instrument for practice at home. We have all been here. Someone is playing on a keyboard that is not adequate for playing intermediate repertoire, or they even just have a really terrible acoustic piano at home, or their parents have not tuned the piano or have it serviced. So again, that will limit a student's ability to truly play expressively with beautiful sound and excellent technique. Number 3, the student doesn't practice, and this is fully on them. I'm not thinking so much about students who from the beginning of their studies habitually did not practice. I'm thinking more about the student who did practice in their elementary studies, and then they hit the dreaded middle school years, or they're very, very busy in high school, and a student who was practicing prior to this point suddenly just is too busy or has somehow lost their interest and they're not putting in the time. So whereas you know they could play that piece, they are not practicing enough to be able to do it. But my 4th reason is one that really lies on the teacher, and that is that the piece that you've given this student is too hard, or that you haven't prepared her adequately for this piece. It is of vital importance that we choose historical repertoire for our students that is at the appropriate level. Occasionally we are blessed with the rare student who is an overachiever, has a very high capacity, has a lot of grit, a good ear, is very good at imitating, and sight reads well perhaps. These students will be able to grunt it out to play the pieces that you put in front of them pretty much no matter what. But that is really not the norm. I'm estimating from my 20 years of experience that that's about 2 to 5% of our student population. Putting repertoire that is too difficult in front of an average student or one who practices an average or below average amount of time is simply demoralizing and kills their desire to play and take lessons. I've noticed a trend, and this is not through real research, this is just through my own experience. I've noticed a trend for teachers to miss a vast section of the piano repertoire, and that is the body that makes up the intermediate historical repertoire. Students leaving a method book series are, in general, not ready to play Mozart's K545 or Debussy's Clair de Lune. Instead, they should be given an incremental program of works by composers who wrote for students. Examples of these types of things, if I survey the main historical time periods, would be things like the Little Preludes by J.S. Bach, Sonatinas by Clementi and Kuhlau, character pieces or etudes by Gurlitt and Heller, short pieces by Kabalevsky and Khachaturian, and much more. There are so many good options out there for anthologies and intermediate graded repertoire series that piano teachers should never feel like they don't have the opportunity to really know and use the intermediate repertoire. Now, I'd like to make one last comment in this section, so we're at the bottom of your second page of your handout, and that is to say that expressivity or artistry and technique are very much intertwined with one another. It is frankly impossible to play a piece expressively if you do not have the capability to navigate the technical demands in that piece. The challenge with talking about technique in a presentation such as this one is that everyone has, of course, their own technical approach and philosophy. And so when we get to the rep at the end of this, I am going to give a few suggestions. However, that's not the most important thing here. The most important thing is that each teacher takes responsibility to create a strategy for developing technique. It's up to the teacher to develop the student's posture, alignment, wrist flexibility, wrist rotation, finger dexterity, and other skills that are needed to move forward in advancing repertoire. All right, so let's get to it. What creates an expressive performance? Some students seem to have a natural knack for imitating style, but how do we teach students who don't innately students who don't innately do what we think is musical? We need to have tools that help them not only play expressively, but learn how to look at a page of music and interpret it. I don't mean that we should be micromanaging every single little phrase, nuance, hand movement, or any of that. I mean that we want to give the students the tools to look at an entire piece, interpret it, and know how to tackle it in a way that makes it sound expressive when they perform it. So what we deem expressive depends first and foremost on the time period in which a piece was written. Secondly, when making expressive choices, we should consider, of course, the composer who wrote it, the individual character of the piece itself, and all of the markings in the score. So by way of launching this discussion, according to historical time period, I have put in your handout one page from our Illinois AIM syllabus. This is from the level 12. It says theory level 12 at the top, but really we're talking about characteristics of the different time periods and composers. I find looking at these categories to be extremely helpful in diving into what makes up a piece in each style, and therefore what should be considered when learning one. And then related to that, on the next page of your handout, which is titled, What Are We Listening For? This is taken from another presentation that I've given in the past. I made a list of things for which, when I am judging, I listen to in a student's playing according to historical context. And that's a very basic list, and that would be especially appropriate for intermediate level. I'm not talking about judging the Van Cliburn competition here. I'm talking about what are we listening to in the everyday performances of the everyday student. If we had time, of course, we could go through all of these time periods, but today I'm going to focus on Baroque and Classical. In general, I found that teachers are most comfortable teaching the Romantic period. It's the one that feels the most natural on the piano, and so much of the richest and well-loved repertoire lies in the 19th century. Additionally, many of the styles that we find in the 20th and 21st centuries look back to previous time periods, neoclassical, neo-romantic, and much of the way that we teach earlier styles should inform how we teach this repertoire from the 20th century. It's also important to note that as time has moved forward, composers have been far clearer in their notation and far clearer about communicating how they would like a performer to interpret their piece. This therefore means that we are required to do much more work on our part in interpreting and teaching interpretation to our students when we're working in the earlier styles from the Baroque and Classical eras. So let's start with Baroque. I love Baroque music. I'm going to blame it on my childhood piano teacher, who was first and foremost an organist. I was always playing Bach. There's something unusually satisfying about a well-performed piece by Bach and the act of practicing Bach. I was just practicing Bach this morning, and it's always good for my soul. All is right in the world when you finish a movement with a Picardy third, am I right? I want my students to find that same satisfaction while also sharing with them the reality that, frankly, playing Bach is hard. I always say to my students when they're learning Bach, repeat after me, Bach is hard. We have to just know that when we're diving into it. Of course, I also share with them my intense love and satisfaction that I find in his music and in the time period in general. As an aside, I also tell my students that playing their first Bach invention is one of the great rites of passage in their piano study and one that's worth celebrating. So if we read through the characteristics in that Illinois AIM page that I gave you, we see the following, and this is how the framework I'm going to use for interpreting this music and deciding how we're going to play expressively. First, we have polyphonic texture, meaning that my audience must be able to clearly hear two or more voices in my performance of a piece. They're not listening for one primary melody with an accompaniment underneath it. Secondly, we have these melodic devices of repetition, imitation, and sequence. And however the composer has used these devices needs to inform how I approach that part. Maybe I'm going to do terraced dynamics, moving louder through each sequence, or maybe I'm going to move it softer through each sequence. I'm going to want to hear the imitative voice coming in, imitating the previous one. We have extensive use of ornamentation, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. We have consistent mood throughout. The Baroque masters believed in one affect for each movement. So whatever the mood is that you decide on with your student, this is a joyful piece, this is a melancholy piece, this is a very serious piece. Whatever it is, it needs to be consistent throughout the whole piece. This might not apply to some advanced works, such as toccatas, but even in those, you have sections that have one mood per section. And then we have the forms here and the types of pieces, such as the dances that make up a Baroque suite. All students must understand these forms, especially those types of dances, and that all music from the Baroque period is in some way linked to dance. Images and videos can be very helpful here because, frankly, in 2021, no one is dancing the minuet. So we need to educate our students so that they have some sort of understanding of this cultural context. It is the thing that is farthest away in our typical piano study from how our students live their lives right now. What's not listed on that list under Baroque period is articulation. The problem is that Baroque composers didn't give us very many articulation markings. And so I'm going to very quickly run you through some rules of thumb or guidelines when deciding articulation. This is going to be like a blitz through articulation. We could talk about this much longer, but I'm going to do it very quickly here. Number one, articulation is an expressive choice. It's not written for us, and it's very common to hear great masters at the piano play Bach or any other Baroque piece on the modern piano and have vastly different ideas about how it should be articulated because it is an expressive choice. And one of the best ways we can lead our students in being expressive in this music and in creating that identity as musicians is to involve them in deciding what articulation they want to use. Now, if you are using an edited version of anything from this time period, the editor likely has put in articulation markings for you, but you have the freedom to change those if the composer didn't write them. So be sure that you are familiarizing yourself with Urtext editions of all of these things, including the Notebook for Anna Magdalena book and the Inventions and the Little Preludes and all of that. Okay, secondly, the default articulation in the Baroque and Classical eras is detached before we get to late Classical. Third, smallest note values in this time period often end up being played legato or connected because it's simply too cumbersome to play them detached. However, if you find yourself playing long strings of connected 16th notes perhaps or other small values, you probably need to consider where could you take a lift and breathe before moving on into the next set. In my opinion, leaps or intervals larger than a third should be detached. And similarly, it's often best to detach before a syncopated note, which gives that note a slight accent. Also, it's best to detach and breathe after a long note. Two-note slurs are appropriate as an expressive choice in moderation, especially if you want to highlight important beats or notes that you want to bring out. And then just to bookend this again, I just want to say once more, articulation is an expressive choice. So you can disagree with my rules of thumb and you can make your own guidelines, but it is something that you should be considering with your students. And articulation is one of the primary ways that your students can be expressive with this type of music. So now let's briefly go back to ornamentation. I don't want to have a long drawn out discussion about this either, but in order to help you and your students, if you do not feel comfortable with this topic, I have also included in your handout with permission a page from the AIM Illinois Level 10 workbook by Karen Rogers, just her table of ornaments. And to briefly say that in general, when I am judging, I find that a lot of students don't execute their ornaments correctly, or at least according to this table. And it is very important to train our students to start ornaments on the note above. So a standard trill, such as the one at the top of that table, should be started on the note above. And the reason I think that students don't typically do this is because they look at the note that's printed on the page. So if you look at that example there, it's a C with a trill over it. We should generally, not always, there's always context to consider, but we should generally start that on D, or D flat if the key signature calls for it. And our students just see the letter C, the note C, and they start there. So that is something we have to encourage our students to learn how to do. All right, so now we're going to move into the actual musical portion of this talk. And what I'm going to do, since we've been talking about vision, having that vision for advanced expressive performance, I'm going to perform for you the Prelude in G sharp minor from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. I'm not going to talk about that piece. I'm going to immediately move into performing the Minuet in D minor from the Notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach. And I'm going to give you some tips for teaching that piece. But I just want you to have in mind how you would choose to expressively play an advanced piece of music with a similar character. So I've chosen two melancholy pieces here to put back to back. we take those expressive considerations, those characteristics from the Baroque period, and apply them to this piece, I'm just going to quickly walk through these. The first that we talked about was the polyphonic lines, and I do love the way that these lines are shaped, particularly with the contrary motion of the right hand moving down and the left hand coming up right at the very beginning. They come together multiple times. And I see a lot of this kind of thing going on in this piece, and I would want my student to hear that and to be able to bring that out. That maybe there are times when the left hand has a natural crescendo as it's moving up a scale and the right hand comes down a little bit, or the reverse. Secondly, we do have a sequence. It's one of the best parts of this minuet, and that's in the second half when you have the first of these in F major, and then it's repeated in D minor. And I would typically encourage my students to experiment a little bit with dynamics on that, but they're probably going to choose to play the F major one louder and then have the D minor one be an echo. And that's one way that you can bring out that sequence. As far as articulation goes, I am looking at this today in the, my cover fell off, the Jane McGraw Masterwork Classics, book 5, and I do generally love McGraw's editing on Baroque music for students. I always keep my text of the notebook for Anna Magdalena handy to show my students that those slurs and other articulation markings were not part of the original score. And I do change a few things in my performance of this from what McGraw has noted. The big one for me that I want to do to be consistent in this particular minuet is detach after that first quarter note. It's the interval of a sixth, and so generally I like to detach on those larger intervals. When you get down later, you can't possibly connect the 10th, and I feel that that's just an echo of the sixth from the beginning. So if I'm going to play that detached, then I should also play that first one in order to be consistent throughout. There are very few ornaments in this piece, so that's not a huge consideration here, but I did add little trills at the end of both sections on the repeat just to have a little fun with that, and you certainly can work through that with your student if you have a creative type who likes to add flourishes to things. Why not add a trill or a mordant somewhere in this one? I think it's totally appropriate. And then lastly, I would say this is a minuet. And so we do have to talk about what that means, and that minuets are not super fast. They're not, it's not the same as a courant or a gigue. I have students who like to play way too fast. I'm sure you do too. But it's also not a really slow dance because it needs to move, and that the natural shape of the steps would encourage you to play in a way that feels like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and you can work on them hands separately or hands together on just having a very slight emphasis on beat 1. It kind of happens naturally in that left-hand pattern with the half notes, but there are other places where you can experiment with it. All right, so let's move on from the Baroque era to the Classical era. Where would we be if we didn't have the piano repertoire of Haydn, Mozart, Clementi, Beethoven, and many others? In this time period, we have the incomparable delight of running scales up and down the piano in our favorite sonatinas. We have the humor of Haydn, the beautiful song-like melodies of Mozart, the intensity and genius of Beethoven. Students often love performing the greatest hits of this time period. How many times have you taught Clementi Opus 36 No. 1 or Mozart K545? For the sake of today's conversation, we're not going to include the rule-defying, groundbreaking later works of Beethoven or the height of the classical era that moves us into the Romantic time period. We're just going to stick to the solidly classical era style. So if we go back to that level 12 characteristics list and we look at the classical era, we see the following. First, we have homophonic texture. As opposed to the Baroque, where we wanted to hear all these individual lines, we now want to clearly hear one beautiful melody adequately but not overwhelmingly supported by the accompaniment. And along with that, we have easily defined phrases. So my phrases should all be shaped beautifully and clearly. The phrases should have a beginning, a peak, and an end, and the hand should lift and breathe between those phrases. Then, probably my favorite part about this era, we have themes of contrasting mood and character. Whereas in the Baroque, we had consistency of mood throughout one movement, the pendulum has swung and we are now doing something totally different. This is what makes the classical era fun. And sonata form is based upon a form developed centuries ago in the theater. And certainly Mozart sonatas and other keyboard works are highly related to theater and opera. So my audience, when I'm performing a piece in this style, should clearly hear the changes in character based on my dynamics and my other expressive choices. Related to that, we have the form of sonatina and sonata allegro form, and students must understand this. Now, you're not going to give your student their first sonatina and have them, automatically within a few weeks understand the intricacies of mature sonata form. I don't mean that. But from the very first sonatina, we should be teaching them the big words of exposition, development, and recapitulation. And yes, recapitulation is one of my favorite music words, and I always tell my students that because there are just so many syllables. So if they don't understand that form, if they don't know that all of the conflict happens in the development and then later on things are resolved in the recapitulation, how will they be able to play expressively? They won't. One of the things that you can do here to really foster that emotional connection for your students is to have them write a story, or at the very least come up with characters that represent the different parts, the different themes, and the different parts of the movement. And so I've had students come up with all kinds of stories. And if you have really precocious, imaginative students, this is very easy. They might come up with something about animals in the forest, or something related to a fairy tale, whether they make up the fairy tale themselves or they base it on one that we all know. Doesn't matter. They might have something in their life that is very dramatic that they then put into it. If you have students who are less precocious or less imaginative, it might be harder to draw this out, and you have to tailor this activity to the individual student at hand. But certainly at the very least, they can come up with one word that describes each different theme, like a character. So this is the victorious character. This is the villain, this is the angry guy. This is the conquering hero. All those kinds of things. We also do not have listed in this time period articulation like we did in the Baroque. Thankfully, for much of our classical repertoire, it's given to us by the composer, or at least parts of it are given to us. So it is our responsibility as teachers to train our students to look for that and to execute it according to what is on the page. And I'll just say again, make sure you're using a really good quality edition so that your articulation marks are what the composer intended. My favorite articulation to teach to even very, very young children is the two-note slur, because we see this in even the easiest historical repertoire. And so a very just basic down, up with the wrist, just flexible wrist and lifting out of the keys to get a more or less gesture should be something that we are training our students from a very young age. And that every time they see that little two-note slur, that's what they do. We also do not have listed here steady tempo, and I find that this era is probably the hardest one in which to maintain a steady tempo. The contrasting themes make it so easy to slow down or speed up without even knowing it. I've been guilty of this myself. So I try to train my students, even from the earliest sonatinas, to play in a steady tempo and yet breathe between the large sections or at a dramatic moment. one other thing that's not listed at this level, and that's the damper pedal. In general, I find that students tend to over-pedal classical era pieces. I caution my students against using any pedal in the classical era with the following exceptions. First, large chords that can use some warm-up and expansion of their sound. Secondly, necessary taps to connect a slur that's just impossible to do with fingers only. And then, of course, slow movements that can tastefully use pedal connection. Now, you may disagree with those three things that I just said, and that's totally fine. But if you don't take away anything else from what I just said, take away that most students tend to over-pedal their classical era pieces, and pedaling needs to be done with thought and care in this time period. And then just a couple of quick personal notes about sonatinas from my years of teaching. There are actually several that are easier than Clementi Opus 36, such as the Spindler Sonatina that we're going to look at today, other composers like Duncombe, Latour, Hesslinger. These show up in all kinds of intermediate collections, and I would commend them to you. Next, I do like to, at least some of the time, teach all movements of a sonata or a sonatina. So if a sonata has 2 or 3 movements, I like to at least look at all 3 with my students. This becomes more difficult when you get to early advanced repertoire, because composers like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven didn't always write sonatas with equal difficulty in all the movements of a sonata. But I at least like to find the occasional sonatina for my student where they can learn the whole thing and understand how you would perform a complete sonatina, partly so that when they go to a recital or a concert, they understand the idea of multiple movements in a sonata or a string quartet or a symphony, and they have an idea of how this works as a whole. And then lastly, with the exception of the 2 easier Beethoven sonatinas, the one in G major and the one in F major, sonatinas by Beethoven and Mozart are very difficult. I love the Viennese sonatinas by Mozart, but I don't teach them very often because they're much harder than they seem like they are when you look at the page. And so I would once again go back to those more minor masters and find several sonatinas by Kuhlau, Clementi, and others to really build that early to mid-intermediate body of repertoire within this time period. All right, so in looking at this last part, I'm going to play the first movement, or an excerpt of the first movement of Mozart's Sonata in B-flat major, and then I'm going to follow that up with the Spindler Sonatina, and we'll have a little chat about how to teach that piece. right, so in looking at how to teach this Spindler sonatina, I love this one because it's very easy. And it's just a really good introduction to sonatinas for students. Not that there isn't anything to work on in here, there certainly is, but it's easier than many of the other early sonatina movements. So if we look at our historical list of characteristics, we know that we're looking for homophonic texture, and yes, certainly in those first 8 bars, the left hand is just doing chords or broken chords a little bit. We do, however, in the development of this piece, have the drama of a contrapuntal texture with the left hand imitating the right hand. And so that's something worth drawing out with your students. Look, your left hand's not playing chords right now. It's imitating the right hand, and it does make the texture more dramatic. So once again, if we're teaching our students the basics of sonatina form, which really this is barely even a sonatina because there's no second theme, there's no modulation to G major at the end of the exposition, we can still label the sections exposition, development, and recapitulation, and we can talk about that the development is where the drama in the story actually occurs before we have the resolution. And so all those accidentals and all of the imitative way that the composer wrote it really make it feel dramatic, and your student's going to want to be able to play that section well and to be able to bring all of that out with the dynamics and the accents and everything. The articulation is marked here. We have loads of 2-note slurs. Students are reticent to do that on this particular development because the hands have to be doing different things. So just one little note in my teaching, when students are having trouble with differing articulations between their right hand and left hand, I encourage them to exaggerate it. So if one hand needs to lift way off of the keys, higher than you ever actually would in performance, simply because that allows our brains to somehow process that our 2 hands are doing 2 different things. I also strongly recommend that your student learns to drop into the accents in this section. And yes, they may play a wrong note like I just did right there, but to have some freedom of movement and to naturally get an accent without hitting the key or without trying, all you have to do is lift and drop. As far as phrasing goes, we didn't talk about shaping the phrases yet, but this is, at the beginning of this piece, a classic example of a short, short, long. And so you have this 2 1-bar phrases, and then the longer one which goes to the downbeat. And so you want to think, go to here, the first beat, here, extend it, just like that. And you can talk with your students about how to shape that, and I don't think it's very hard to do in that part. All right, I hope that has given you a few ideas on how to teach the Spindler sonatina. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of having a vision for our students of where we're going, and then kind of how we can directly apply having a vision for advanced expressive performance down towards the late elementary and early intermediate historical repertoire. I'd love to connect with any of you. Please feel free to reach out, ask me any questions that you have. Best wishes in all your teaching.